Do you believe that the truth always prevails? A lie in court can ruin a person until undeniable evidence appears. Today's story will shock you. When a police officer thinks her testimony is enough, a video flips everything around. Will justice prevail, or will deceit overpower it? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you believe in the truth, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more intense stories like this one. The bright lights in the courtroom made the space even more suffocating. Stephen sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clenched tightly together, each heavy breath pressing against his chest. He wasn't unfamiliar with hardship, but he'd never felt so suffocated by the system as he did now. Today, his fate no longer lay in his hands, but in the testimonies and evidence, or perhaps just in a perfectly constructed story. Christopher, a social activist, a man who stood up for justice, was now being falsely accused. The unreasonable charges of assaulting a police officer had trapped him in a legal nightmare that he couldn't escape on his own. And when Anthony, a seasoned police officer with 15 years on the job, took the witness stand, all eyes were on her. She was the only one who could confirm whether Christopher had truly committed the crime. "Detective Anthony, did you see the defendant actively assault Officer Camden?" Prosecutor Robert asked, his tone calm but laced with implication. Stephen held his breath. He looked into Anthony's eyes, hoping she would speak the truth, but the answer came, severing all remaining hope. "Yes, I saw him throw a punch and hit Camden in the jaw." The room froze. Every tiny sound became deafening, as if the whole world was left with that one accusation. Whispers started to ripple through the courtroom. Some looked at Christopher with suspicion. Others saw the despair in his eyes. But on the defense side, Attorney Robert was unfazed. He slowly stood up, adjusted his suit, and walked to the witness stand. "Detective Anthony, you've testified many times in court, haven't you?" "Yes. And you understand the importance of accuracy?" "Of course." Robert smiled faintly. Then he turned away and signaled to his assistant. The lights in the courtroom dimmed, and a large screen began displaying footage from a security camera. Everyone held their breath. The video appeared, clear, undeniable. Christopher hadn't thrown the first punch. It was Officer Camden who pushed him first. Christopher's act of self-defense had been twisted into an assault. The air seemed to drain out of the room. Anthony's face went rigid. She stared at the screen, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had believed she'd seen something, but now the truth was betraying her testimony. "Detective Anthony," Robert said slowly, his voice low but sharp like a knife, "would you like to amend your testimony?" The room fell silent. A woman gasped. Someone whispered, "She lied." Anthony felt the world spinning around her. She had become part of a terrible mistake. And now, with the eyes of everyone on her, she understood that the truth could never be buried forever. The light in the courtroom dimmed as the video was projected onto the large screen. A chill ran down Anthony's spine as she saw herself face the undeniable truth. She recalled the moment on the witness stand, confidently asserting that Christopher had thrown the first punch. She had believed she was right. She had believed that she had seen clearly what had happened that night. But now, before her, was an entirely different story. In the video, Christopher didn't rush to attack Officer Camden. He stood there, both hands raised, palms open, an unmistakable sign of non-aggression. It was Camden who moved in first, pushing hard into Christopher, causing him to lose his balance. Just seconds later, Christopher was brought to the ground, punches landing before he could even react. The room fell into silence. No one dared to even breathe. All eyes were on Anthony, sitting motionless in the witness chair. She felt her head spin. Prosecutor Robert looked down at the table, his lips tightly pressed together. He had built the entire case on Anthony's testimony, but now that testimony was worthless. Defense attorney Robert didn't rush to cross-examine. He let the silence stretch, allowing everyone to feel the weight of the truth. Then, slowly, he moved toward the witness stand, his voice calm but carrying the strength of a storm. "Detective Anthony, would you like to amend your testimony?" Anthony opened her mouth, but no words came out. She felt the eyes around her, the disappointment, the anger. But perhaps the worst of all was the loss of trust. Below, Christopher sat quietly, his jaw clenched. He had known this was coming. He had understood how the system could twist the truth to fit its own purpose. But what hurt him the most wasn't the false accusations. It was the truth that so many people were willing to believe it without any evidence. From the back of the room, a voice broke the silence. "You lied." A ripple of whispers spread through the room. Some people nodded, others turned to look at each other, realizing they had been led down an entirely false path. Anthony swallowed hard, knowing she couldn't avoid this any longer. In a voice almost trembling, she uttered, I was wrong." Those words, though small, echoed throughout the room. They weren't just a confession. They were an opening to a different truth, one that people could no longer ignore. Christopher closed his eyes, took a deep breath. Finally, he had a glimmer of hope. But he also knew this battle wasn't over. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt suffocating. The flickering light from the screen reflected off Anthony's tense face, while Christopher sat still, his gaze cold, but his emotions swirling inside. He didn't need to say anything more. The video had said it all. Robert took a step forward, his voice calm but resonating. "Detective Anthony, in your previous testimony, you swore that Christopher Holt initiated the attack, but the video just shown proves the opposite. Can you explain?" All eyes in the room turned to Anthony. She clenched her hands on the witness stand, a sense of humiliation rising within her. She had believed what she had said, but now she realized that sometimes memory and reality don't align. Or perhaps, more painfully, the system had led her to believe a false narrative from the start. She swallowed hard, her throat dry. "I believed I saw what happened at that moment, but I was wrong." A shockwave spread through the room. A police officer admitting her mistake on the witness stand. This was not something that happened often. Some people whispered, others exchanged stunned glances. Prosecutor Robert clenched his fist. In the defendant's seat, Christopher felt the weight in his chest lift. But the sense of victory wasn't as sweet as he had imagined. It couldn't erase the months he had spent being treated like a criminal, nor could it ease the pain his mother had felt watching her son handcuffed and helpless. Robert scanned the room and then turned back to Anthony, his voice breaking the tense silence. "So you admit that the defendant didn't commit the crime, as you testified?" Anthony looked at Christopher, her eyes full of conflict. She was no longer a strong law enforcement officer. She was just a person facing the consequences of her mistakes. "I admit I made a mistake." That confession was not only a shock to those present in the courtroom, but also a turning point in Anthony's life. But could it undo the damage she had caused? Christopher clenched his fists, looking at Anthony for a long time before speaking. A confession alone can't change everything. The room fell silent. It was true. Justice couldn't rely on a late apology. It required real change, and today, that change was just beginning. The courtroom felt suffocating, as if the space itself was being compressed. Christopher sat in the defendant's chair, his hands clenched tightly, his eyes filled with disappointment, but still holding a steady, unwavering gaze. He had endured so much already, and now, When the truth was on the verge of being revealed, he was still being forced to prove his innocence. Robert stood beside him, his sharp gaze directed at the prosecutor, but his voice held no anger, only certainty. Let the truth speak for itself. Everyone in the room turned toward the screen. The video began to play. At first, there were only shaky images of the chaotic crowd, the sounds of shouting, flashing lights. Then Christopher appeared, but not in the position of an attacker as was claimed. Instead, he was a person trying to raise his hand, palms open, with no sign of aggression. Anthony, sitting on the witness stand, held her breath as the images became clearer. She had testified in court that Christopher struck first, but now the screen showed a completely different story. Another police officer, Camden, was the one who pushed Christopher first. And then it wasn't Christopher who struck, but other officers who ruthlessly subdued him. The room fell into a suffocating silence. Eyes shifted from the screen to Anthony. She could feel it, loss of trust, anger, and disappointment from those who had once believed she represented fairness. Christopher took a deep breath and turned toward Anthony. "So, am I still the troublemaker you said I was?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a deep sense of hurt. Anthony wanted to say something, to defend herself, to explain that she thought she had seen what was right. But now, she knew there was no explanation that could erase the truth that was being laid bare before everyone. Robert was not in a hurry. He slowly walked toward the witness stand, looked straight at Anthony. "You testified under oath that Christopher Holt attacked first, but the video shows the opposite. Do you wish to amend your testimony?" The question hit like a verdict. Anthony looked down at her clenched hands. She had spent her career believing she stood on the side of justice, but today, justice was proving she was wrong. She lifted her head, her eyes filled with all the torment. I was wrong." The room erupted in whispers, disbelief spreading. But amid all the noise, Christopher remained silent. He didn't smile, didn't show any sense of vindication. Because, for him, a confession couldn't undo what he had gone through. But perhaps this was a sign of something new, an opportunity for change. Robert nodded and stepped back. Then justice must be served. The room fell silent once more, but this time it wasn't a heavy silence. It was the movement of the truth, a truth that could no longer be buried. The courtroom still carried the lingering shock from the video that had just been played. Anthony sat there, her hands resting on her lap, no longer the confident or proud figure of a law enforcer. She had dedicated her career to believing in justice, but now she was just a witness facing the harsh truth. Christopher remained still, but his eyes spoke volumes, a pain not just for himself, but for all those who had suffered the same injustice. Wrongfully accused, judged not by actions but by biases. Robert slowly approached Anthony, his voice low but filled with weight. "Detective Landry, you testified in court that Christopher Holt was the one who attacked first, but the video shows a different truth. Do you have anything to say?" She swallowed hard, feeling cornered. There was no longer any way to deny it. She looked up, meeting the gaze of Robert, of Christopher, of everyone who was watching her. "I was wrong." Her voice was soft, but reverberated throughout the room. A brief silence filled the space. Then the anger from the audience erupted. Whispers, doubtful glances, shaking heads in disappointment. Not just disappointment with her, but disappointment in a system they had once trusted. Christopher still said nothing, no smugness, no explosive anger, just a deep, knowing gaze, as if he had always expected this outcome, but it came too late to heal the wounds he had suffered. Robert took a deep breath, turning to face the jury. "You've seen the truth, not by words, but by clear evidence, no fingerprints, no weapon, no motive, just a man trampled by a system that was never meant for him. A long pause. One of the jurors glanced sideways at the person next to them, as if they were beginning to understand something much larger than the trial itself. Suddenly, Christopher spoke, his voice calm but sharp. "I don't want an apology. I don't need pity. I only want one thing, that no one else has to go through what I have." The entire room fell into deep thought. His words were not just for those present here, but resonated farther, reaching those watching the case, those out there still judged by their appearance. Anthony lowered her head. She had once believed she always stood for justice, but today she realized that true justice wasn't just what was written on paper, it was how people treated one another. The judge looked around the room, his voice steady but firm. "We've heard enough. The jury will now deliberate." All eyes were on the group of jurors, but no matter the outcome, one thing was clear: some truths could not be hidden forever. And today, a small part of justice had been reclaimed. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the final verdict. No one dared to breathe too loudly, and all eyes were on Christopher. He sat there motionless, his hands tightly clasped, but his gaze was no longer filled with anger or skepticism. It was the look of someone who had grown too familiar with injustice, someone who had been pushed to the depths by the system, but still held onto their dignity. The jury returned to their seats, their faces tense. One of them, a middle-aged woman with graying hair, cleared her throat before reading the conclusion. "We find the defendant not guilty." The room erupted in emotion. Some people cried, others sighed in relief, but Christopher remained still, as if he couldn't believe what he had just heard. Robert, who had fought tirelessly to defend him, turned and gave his shoulder a gentle pat. "You did it," he said, his voice low but filled with emotion. In the back, Emma, Christopher's mother, couldn't hold back her tears. She had waited for this moment through countless long months. Her hands trembled as she raised them to cover her mouth, as if afraid that this was just a dream that would vanish when she opened her eyes. She quickly moved toward her son and embraced him tightly. "I knew you didn't do anything wrong," she whispered in his ear. But amidst the joy, not everyone felt satisfied. Anthony, who had given false testimony in court, sat silently in the back row. She lowered her head, her face tense, understanding that she had lost everything: her honor, her career, and the trust of those who had once seen her as a model enforcer of the law. She had believed she was protecting the law, but it turned out she was just a tool for a system rotting from within. Christopher finally stood up. He looked around the room and then walked to the witness stand, where he had once defended his own innocence. He looked directly at those who had supported him, but also at those who had tried to tear him down. "I should never have had to prove my innocence," he said, his voice calm but heavy with weight. "No one should have to do that." His words silenced the room. No one could refute it because it was the truth. Too many people had been treated unfairly. Too many had been wrongfully convicted because of baseless prejudice and assumptions. Robert smiled lightly, not out of personal victory, but because finally justice had spoken, even if it was a rare occasion. "What will you do next?" he asked. Christopher took a deep breath, looking at those who had stood by him. "I won't let this story fade into obscurity," he replied. "If this can happen to me, it can happen to anyone. I will fight so no one has to suffer this again." Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. They weren't just celebrating Christopher's victory. They were speaking up for others, those who had never had the chance to stand before justice and defend themselves. A new wave had been stirred, and Christopher knew his journey had only just begun. The courtroom was thick with tension as Christopher stepped up to the witness stand. Each of his steps echoed in the suffocating silence, his eyes scanning the faces that followed him, jurors, the judge, the prosecutor, and the crowd eagerly waiting. Among them, his mother, Emma, sat in the front row, her hands tightly clenched, her eyes filled with worry but also unwavering belief in her son. Anthony, who had once stood on this very stand and testified against Christopher, now sat silently, her hands clenched in her lap. She had believed she was fulfilling her duty to uphold justice, but now, with the truth exposed, she couldn't help but question herself. What she thought was the truth was now being violently shaken. Robert, Christopher's attorney, stood beside him, offering a reassuring look. He knew this was the pivotal moment. The prosecutor had painted a distorted picture of Christopher, depicting him as a troublemaker, a threat to the community. But now was the time for Christopher to speak for himself. No one could do it for him. Christopher took a deep breath and looked directly at the prosecutor. "I'm not the person you've described," he said, his voice calm but full of weight. "I've been misjudged, falsely accused, pushed into this system because of what people think of me, not because of what I've done." The room fell into complete silence. The prosecutor raised an eyebrow but said nothing, because, try as he might, he could not deny what was unfolding. The evidence was pointing to a truth that was completely different from the original accusations. Christopher continued, his voice now deeper, resonating with everyone in the room. "If that video hadn't been shown today, would I have had a chance to clear my name? Or would I have become one of the thousands wrongly convicted and forgotten?" He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. We must ask ourselves this: is justice truly fair when a person has to fight to prove their innocence? Emma's throat tightened as she watched her son, proud yet heartbroken. No mother wants to see her child go through this. But Christopher was no longer the boy she had protected. He had become a man ready to fight, not only for himself, but for others. The jury exchanged looks, hesitation clear on their faces. They had heard the accusations, but they had also seen the evidence. And now, they were seeing a person standing before them, a person who had been treated unjustly and was fighting to reclaim the truth. Robert placed a hand on Christopher's shoulder as he stepped down from the witness stand. "You've done what not many dare to do," he said softly. "You've made them think." The judge hammered the gavel, declaring a break while the jury deliberated. As Christopher returned to his seat, his mother took his hand tightly, her eyes brimming with tears. "No matter what happens, I'm proud of you," she whispered. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, not only to follow the trial, but to demand justice. Because they knew Christopher was not just fighting for himself, he was fighting for all those who had been wronged by the system. And no matter the verdict, one thing was clear: he was no longer a victim. He had become a voice, a symbol for change. The courtroom fell into a silence so thick you could hear every pounding heartbeat. Christopher stood in the center, his hands clenched tightly together, his gaze fixed on the judge. But inside, he could feel the weight of every pair of eyes in the room. Today's trial wasn't just about him. It was about people like him, those who had never had a chance to speak their truth. Emma, his mother, sat in the front row, her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to keep calm. She had watched her son walk into the courtroom as the defendant, but today she saw him as a warrior. This mother wasn't just worried about the verdict. Her heart ached for everything Christopher had gone through, the months of being confined, the times he was treated like a criminal before being proven innocent. Robert, Christopher's attorney, stood beside him, his gaze sharp yet filled with trust. He knew this moment was the most important one. They had exposed the lies, presented the evidence showing the police had been wrong. But would justice truly prevail, or would the system find a way to cover up its mistakes? The jury began to file in one by one. Christopher felt his body stiffen, but he kept his back straight, because no matter what happened, he would never forget that he had stood up, that he had fought. There was nothing left to fear. "Has the jury reached a decision?" the judge asked, his face stern and unreadable. The foreman of the jury stood up, holding the paper tightly. The room seemed to hold its breath. "We find the defendant, Christopher Holt." The pause felt like it lasted forever. Emma closed her eyes tightly, Robert leaned forward slightly, and Christopher simply waited. "Not guilty." A second of silence, then everything erupted. Half the room cheered, applause ringing out as reporters scrambled to take notes. Emma burst into tears, pulling her son into a tight embrace, her body trembling with emotion. Christopher held her shoulders, his gaze filled with resolve. But not everyone was celebrating. On the other side of the room, Anthony, the police officer who had given the false testimony, lowered her head, her face hardening. She had believed she was serving justice, but now the truth had hit her square in the face. She was wrong, and the system she had placed all her trust in had been wrong too. Christopher took a deep breath, rising from the defendant's chair. He didn't look back at Anthony, didn't glance at the prosecutor. He simply looked toward his mother and the people who had supported him. Outside the courtroom, hundreds of people had gathered. As Christopher walked out, they erupted in applause, not just because he was free, but because they knew this wasn't the victory of one individual. It was a victory for all those who had been treated unjustly. Robert patted Christopher on the shoulder. "You did it." But Christopher knew this was only the beginning, because there were so many people like him still trapped in this system, and he wouldn't stop, not until justice truly belonged to all. The courtroom fell into an eerie silence. All eyes were on Christopher, who had just stepped away from the defendant's stand with a resolute expression. He was no longer the young man trapped in a flawed system. He had fought, confronted false accusations, and now he stood as the victor. But deep down, he knew this battle was far from over. Emma, his mother, couldn't stop the tears streaming down her face. These weren't just tears of joy, but also of regret. She thought back to the sleepless nights, wondering if her son would be crushed by the system. But now, seeing Christopher standing there, free and strong, she realized her son had become someone else, someone who didn't just fight for himself, but for people like him. Next to Christopher, Robert, the seasoned attorney who had believed in him from the start, smiled softly. But his eyes were filled with contemplation. He knew that the system didn't change easily after just one trial. People like Christopher don't always have the luck of a video proving their innocence. There were still many people out there, sitting in jails, wrongly accused, whose voices had never been heard. Meanwhile, Anthony, who had stood on the witness stand to protect his false testimony, lowered his head. He knew his career would never be the same again. But what worried him more was the gaze of those around him. Before, he could stand in his uniform and be respected, trusted. But now, everything had changed. A lie exposed before millions of eyes. Something even a veteran officer couldn't easily overcome. Outside the courtroom, the crowd cheered, but Christopher didn't feel this was a moment to celebrate. He looked around, seeing unfamiliar faces filled with empathy. People who had followed his story from beginning to end. They weren't just happy for a young man being exonerated. They were celebrating because, finally, this system had been challenged. Emma hugged her son tightly, as if afraid to lose him again. Christopher squeezed her hand, reassuring her that he was stronger now, that he was ready for the next step. Robert walked over to Christopher, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We won't stop here," he said, his voice calm but determined. Christopher nodded. He understood Robert's meaning. He couldn't just walk out of this courtroom and return to normal life. Not after everything he had been through. Not after knowing there were still so many who didn't have the chance he did. He looked into the cameras, at the people waiting for something from him. A word, an action, a hope. "My story isn't unique," Christopher said, his voice steady. "I was lucky, but how many others out there aren't as fortunate as I am? How many people are swallowed by this system and no one hears their voices? Today I walk out of here as a free man, but I won't stop here. I'll do everything I can to make sure others get the chance to be heard." The crowd erupted in applause, but Christopher didn't smile. He didn't see this as a personal victory. This was only the beginning of a much larger journey. And he wouldn't stop, not until justice truly came for everyone. The courtroom was silent, heavy with tension. Christopher stood at the defendant's stand, his gaze unwavering, though his eyes betrayed an undeniable pain. Over the past few months, he had fought not just to prove his innocence, but to expose a system filled with injustice. He had once thought that by speaking the truth, justice would naturally be on his side, but he was wrong. The prosecutor stared at him, searching for any crack in his defense. But Christopher was no longer the scared boy he once was. He didn't tremble, didn't back down. In this moment, he knew he had to stand firm, not only for himself, but for those who had been in his shoes, but never had the chance to speak up. In the audience, Emma, his mother, quietly shed tears. Her heart ached as she watched her son stand there, facing the system she had once trusted. She remembered the sleepless nights, wondering if her son would be crushed by this very system. But now, seeing Christopher standing there, free and strong, she realized her son had become someone else. Someone who wasn't just fighting for himself, but for people like him. Beside him, Robert, Christopher's experienced lawyer, clenched his fist. He had witnessed too many unfair trials, too many destinies determined simply because people didn't have the power to fight back. But Christopher had done what few dared. He had fought against the system and exposed its lies under the light of justice. The judge's gavel struck. His voice rang out deep and solemn. "The jury has reached a verdict." The atmosphere in the room was so tense that it felt as though everyone could hear their own heartbeat. "Christopher is not guilty. All charges are dismissed." A moment of silence passed. Then the courtroom erupted. Half the room cheered, applause echoed, and reporters rushed to jot down notes. Emma burst into tears, clutching her son, her whole body shaking with emotion. Christopher gripped her shoulders, his eyes filled with resolve. But not everyone was celebrating. Across the room, Anthony, the officer who had given false testimony, lowered her head, her face stiff. She had believed she was upholding the law, but now the truth had struck her square in the face. She had been wrong, and the system she had once placed so much trust in was wrong too. Christopher took a deep breath and stood up from the defendant's chair. He didn't turn to look at Anthony or the prosecutor. He only looked at his mother and the people who had supported him. Outside the courtroom, a crowd had gathered. As Christopher walked out, they all cheered, not just because he had been set free, but because they knew this wasn't the victory of just one man. It was for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. Robert patted Christopher's shoulder. "You did it," he said softly. But Christopher knew this was just the beginning. There were too many people like him still stuck in the system, and he wouldn't stop, not until justice truly belonged to all. When the reporters surrounded him, one asked, "Now that you're free, what will you do next?" Christopher looked into the cameras without hesitation. "I'll make sure no one else has to go through what I went through," His words resonated with millions. A wave spread through the crowd, not just of support, but of a warning to a system that had existed too long without challenge. That night, Christopher couldn't sleep. He sat in a small room, staring at the dark sky outside the window. His freedom wasn't just won by truth, it was also won by the people who had believed in him. And now he knew he had to use that freedom to fight for those still trapped in the darkness. Because justice doesn't end with a verdict. It starts with those who dare to speak up. Christopher's story wasn't just a personal battle. It was a powerful reminder of the value of truth, justice, and courage. It shows that, in a world where prejudice and power can manipulate human destinies, only determination and knowledge can help us break free from the shadow of injustice. Christopher didn't accept the fate the system imposed on him. Instead, he stood up, not only for himself, but for those who didn't have the chance to speak up. The greatest lesson from this story is that silence never brings justice. When faced with injustice, we can choose to bow our heads or stand up to change things. Justice isn't something that's simply given. It must be protected and earned by human courage. And sometimes, just one person daring to speak can ignite a wave of change. This story also reminds us that knowledge is the most powerful weapon. It was Christopher's understanding of the law that allowed him to fight back against false accusations. When we arm ourselves with knowledge, we are no longer victims of the system. We can be the ones to change it. After everything, justice isn't just a verdict. It's the constant fight to build a fairer world. Each of us has a responsibility to not turn our backs on the truth, Thank you for watching. If you found this video interesting or enjoyable, please show your support by giving it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow and reach more amazing viewers like you. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on our future uploads. Your support means the world to us and keeps us motivated to create even better content for you.